All right. So if you look at all the research that's been done on this, and there's been now 3 or 4 decades of research, if you talk to journalists, if you ask journalists, as you could ask me to reflect on my own experience as a journalist, here's the one thing that you come to. The mainstream corporate commercial news in the United States is dominated by official sources. All this research, really reduces to that one statement. In mainstream corporate commercial news, that news that is at the center of the political communication system we have in this country. Right? In mainstream corporate commercial news, official sources dominate. It's really that simple. So what do we mean by official sources? We mean sources who have some sort of status in the culture by virtue of their identification with institutions. The 2 primary institutions in this culture are the government and the corporation. In this culture, you want to look at the contemporary United States and ask, where does power lie? It lies basically in 2 places. Those people who control the political system and those people who control the economic system. Power in this culture rests mostly with political and with economic institutions. That means the government, the formal institutions of government, from the local, state to federal level, and the corporation. Right? Think about power. Think about institutions that hold power. The vast majority of that power is held in the government and in the corporate sector. And you will find that the vast majority of sources used in corporate commercial journalism, in mainstream journalism, are official sources who come from the government or the corporate sector. It's that simple. Those are the people who not only, whose voices you will hear and see in the news, those are the people who have an extraordinary amount of power to shape what is news, official sources. Okay. So my claim here is very simple. That if you want to understand objectivity in journalism, not simply as a set of ideals that most of us will endorse, but how objectivity is embodied in actual practices. In other words, we're asking not what's the rhetoric around objectivity, but how is objectivity made real through the way journalists work? The answer I'm suggesting is very simple, that official sources from these powerful institutions dominate the shaping of the news and are disproportionately present in the final presentation of the news. That's what objectivity really means. That when journalists learn the appropriate practices, when journalists are socialized into the routines of journalism, when journalists learn the protocols, the rituals, all these are terms to just recognize that journalism is like any other job. There's a certain way it's done. And you learn that. Part of it you learn through formal education. Part of it you learn from training on the job. Some of it you learn just by observing and absorbing. That journalism, like any other job or profession, has a way of doing things. And that way of doing things is rooted in a preference for and dependence on official sources. And that's what objectivity really means. Because when you go out in the world and you report a story, there are a wide range of potential sources. How do you decide which sources you are going to rely on? In journalism, the answer is you rely on those sources who have credibility, who have some authority. And those sources will overwhelmingly, it turns out, come from those 2 centers of power, the government and the corporation. Now notice, I'm not saying every single source in the news is from one of those 2 sites. I'm saying that they tend to dominate. Journalists can and sometimes do rely on sources from other areas in the culture. But every study that's ever been done shows the dominance of those official sources. So far you might be saying, so what's the problem? Well, the problem or the potential problem should be evident given all of our conversation. about these concepts of neutrality and ideology. Sources come from somewhere, have some worldview and some set of interests. And when they engage in interaction with journalists to shape the news and to provide the information that then becomes the news, they have interests. And if the news is dominated by those official sources, not surprisingly, the news will reflect the views of those sources, and that's what we're really trying to wrestle with. But before we get there, let me play you a clip that I think demonstrates what I'm trying to talk about. This is a short clip from a few years ago on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Okay, you're all familiar with The Daily Show? It's a comedy show that includes a lot of commentary on current events. And Jon Stewart has lots of guests on from politics and media and all sorts of places. So I don't need to tell you about The Daily Show. All right. This is a clip of an interview between Jon Stewart and Wolf Blitzer, the CNN anchor. It came shortly after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And as you know from reading, that there has been a lot of discussion about the failure of the U.S. news media to adequately subject claims made by the U.S. government especially about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The failure of the U.S. news media to subject those claims to scrutiny. So you know the story. The U.S. government made claims that the government of Saddam Hussein in Iraq was stockpiling biological and chemical weapons and possibly developing a nuclear weapon. Correct? And that much of the justification for the invasion of Iraq was based on those claims. Those claims turned out to be false or fraudulent, depending on how you think, what you think was the intention of the government. But it turned out there weren't those weapons. And so Wolf Blitzer, who's, again, an anchor at CNN, he's right in the center of mainstream journalism, yes? I mean, Wolf Blitzer is not some crank off on the margins. He's right there in the middle of one of the most important cable news networks in the country. So Wolf Blitzer is responding to Jon Stewart's question about why the media failed to provide that critical reporting. And I want you to pay attention to how Wolf Blitzer responds to this. So a couple of things about that clip. First of all, this has nothing to do with our question about objectivity. Every time I watch that clip, I'm struck by here you have an anchor at one of the most important news outlets in the United States. Whatever you think about television news or cable news or CNN, it's a crucial news outlet. If you were to go to my parents' house, my mother gets about 98% of her information about the world from CNN, as far as I can tell. Okay. So CNN is an important outlet. And Wolf Blitzer has one of the prime spots as an anchor on CNN. And here he is on a comedy show making jokes with a comedian about whether or not he mentioned, Wolf Blitzer, CNN. Did you pick up on that? That this is serious stuff. I mean, journalism, journalists can get pretty self-important sometimes, but part of the reason is because journalists deal with important stuff. And what does it say about a culture when a journalist who's charged with the task of providing people with the information so they can be good citizens can yuck it up on a comedy show with admittedly rather funny comedians sometimes about, hey, did you mention my show? CNN, late edition with Wolf Blitzer? This is all a joke, right? Something to think about. How shows like comedy, or what's it called, The Daily Show and The Colbert Report and all these, they're often providing interesting satire, and I don't watch them regularly, but I find them interesting at times. But what have they done to the culture? That's a background question. That's for you to ponder. Is it appropriate for an anchor at one of the major cable news networks to go on and, in that kind of sarcastic, self-promoting way, make it all seem like a joke? I don't know. The fact that I'm asking the question will suggest that I don't like it, but you can come to your own judgment. But what I really want to highlight in this clip is when Wolf Blitzer acknowledges that the U.S. news media failed to hold the U.S. government accountable for claims about the weapons. He acknowledges it. He starts by saying we should have been more skeptical. Okay? So he's acknowledging a failure, which is good. It's important to be able to acknowledge one's own failures. Okay? But then he goes on and he explains how it happened. Yes, we failed. Let me tell you, he says to Jon Stewart, why we failed. And he says, remember, and he uses the word everybody. Everybody was saying the same thing. Did you hear what he said there? He got all the briefings, okay? Wolf Blitzer got all the briefings, he says. Did he get some of the briefings? Did he get just some of them? No, he got all of the briefings. Thank you very much. Right? Now, obviously, Wolf Blitzer didn't talk to every human being, but when he says, I got all the briefings, what he's suggesting is that he got all of the relevant briefings, all of the important briefings, all of the briefings that mattered. When he says, I got all the briefings, he's saying, you know, I did my job the way I'm supposed to. I went to all of the appropriate, relevant, important places to get briefed. And so what was on that list of all the briefings? He said he went to the CIA, he went to the Pentagon, he went to Congress, and when he went to Congress, he went to both the House and the Senate. I mean, he really was working there. Wolf's on overtime at this point. He goes to the intelligence committees. He implies that he probably talked to both Republicans and Democrats. He doesn't mention it, but the White House, the executive branch, was part of this as well, and no doubt Wolf got briefed there too. So Wolf says, I got all the briefings. And what is his list of all? What's on the list of that which is encompassed by the word all? Pardon? Government agencies, these official sources. All right, do people in the CIA potentially know something about weapons of mass destruction in another country? Sure. Do people in the Pentagon know? Sure. Do people in the Congress know? Sure. But think about the universe that's defined by those agencies. Is that all the world? Is the list of the CIA, the Pentagon, Congress, the White House, does that exhaust the list of possible sources in the world about whether or not Iraq at that point had weapons of mass destruction programs? Well, only if your world is very narrow. Because one can imagine lots of other sources that might have had something important to say about the question of Iraqi weapons programs. Who might some of those other sources be? Well, how about other countries in the Middle East and sources in those countries who happen to be actually in the region and might know something? What about Iraqi defectors, people who've been in Iraq and came back? There was actually some information on the public record from Iraqi defectors that suggested that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction. What about people who might have once been part of those official institutions but were no longer there? Well, there was somebody like that too, a guy named Scott Ritter, who was a former UN weapons inspector who was readily available to the news and was saying for quite a long period of time before the Iraq invasion that there were no weapons in Iraq, that the weapons inspectors had in fact demonstrated that. There were people in what we generally call the anti-war movement, people who were mobilizing to oppose an invasion, who had information, had various kinds of contacts and experience in the Middle East, and had information. Now, as I always want to emphasize, none of this discussion really hangs on your own opinion about the war, the invasion, or anything else. We will disagree. There's a lot of people in the room, and as I always emphasize, I assume there are a lot of different positions about the legitimacy of the war and all of that. What we're asking now is simply, what is a relevant source in trying to understand the question of whether or not Iraq had active weapons of mass destruction programs in 2003. Right. Wolf Blitzer's list of all the briefings, implying all the relevant source, was limited to a very narrow spectrum. If you moved outside that narrow spectrum, you found that the government's claim that Iraq had weapons started to look a little shaky. And I'm not talking about in hindsight. I'm not talking about what we know now looking back. I'm talking about what you could have known then by simply expanding the list of relevant sources. Those sources were there and they were readily available. And in fact, if you read the press from other parts of the world, or if you read the alternative press, the independent press, if you moved outside of the mainstream corporate commercial news in the United States, you would find that those sources were being engaged, and those stories were being written, and those critical questions were being asked. So when Wolf Blitzer says we should have been more skeptical, the we he's talking about is that mainstream corporate commercial press in the United States. And he's correct, and I admire him for acknowledging that failure. But at that same time, if you expand the we to be not just those journalists, but a larger world, that skepticism was being voiced. Those questions were being asked, and other sources beyond the U.S. government agencies he lists were being consulted. And if you read that other press, you would have gotten a very different picture. So the point of this is to not just tell you what I think journalists mean by official sources, but to look at what a journalist himself, in this case, says were the relevant sources. And they do tend to be these sources who come from, in this case, it was the government. In other cases, those sources might come more out of the corporate world. But those two institutions, the government and the corporation, supply a disproportionate amount of the information to journalists. And it's not just the information, it's the way they're involved in shaping the news. That's what official sources do. They try to shape the news to reflect their interests, which is not surprising. It is not surprising that people with power and wealth, when they are consulted as sources by journalists, try to shape the news in a way that's consistent with them retaining their power and wealth. There's nothing unusual about that. I mean, that's not a radical statement. That's just kind of observing human nature. In my experience, people with wealth and power like to promote a view of the world that allows them to maintain their wealth and power. That's simple. My argument then is that's what objectivity really means in practice. If you strip away all of the rhetoric and the ideals and the talk about objectivity and whether or not we can really attain it or not attain it, what objectivity means in practice for journalism is a reliance, I would say an over-reliance, some might even say a kind of almost slavish reliance on official sources. Okay. Now, what's wrong with that? Why would we want to critique that? Okay. We've already touched on some of this, but let's organize our thinking on this. What are the potential problems with a journalism whose objective practices rely too heavily on official sources? Well, this list just puts in more clear form what we've been talking about. Obviously, if you rely on those official sources, which embody a kind of conventional wisdom about how the world works and should work, this kind of objectivity is going to skew the news toward that conventional wisdom. If you are constantly not only using information from, but relying on sources to shape the news who are putting forward what I'm in shorthand calling this conventional wisdom, that's what the news is going to look like. Again, not in every case. I'm not talking about every story. I'm not saying there's never a journalist who breaks out of this. We're talking about patterns. And this is the pattern that you will see. Another effect of this, it's going to marginalize dissident voices. Because dissident voices don't tend to come from these powerful institutions. Dissidents almost by definition are outside. They're on the fringe. They don't hold positions of great power. They don't tend to have great wealth. They can't employ armies of public relations professionals to put forward their views. Dissident voices tend to be from people without access to that kind of institutional authority or the money that allows them to employ public relations. The result of this is it's going to reinforce the ideology of the powerful. Now, if you think the ideology of the powerful is appropriate, then maybe this doesn't seem like a problem. But the fact is, journalism holds itself out, remember, as neutral and non-ideological. And so the question is clear. If journalism is saying to the population in a society, listen, you can trust us because we're neutral and we're non-ideological. We're outside of the play of power. We come and bring to bear on the world an independent eye and speak in an independent voice. If that's journalism's pitch to why you should read and listen to them, there's a problem if the practices by which journalism is constructed end up reinforcing the ideology of the powerful, because then all of a sudden journalism is not neutral and not non-ideological. So we're looking not at the sort of rhetoric of journalism, we're looking at the actual practices. Okay. Now, one more question. Why? I mean, what I'm saying is not some advanced theoretical physics equation, yes? You seem to be following the logic of the argument. And whether you agree with it completely or not, I would argue you have to agree there's something to it. There's something here that's important. Why don't journalists then acknowledge and grapple with this? Why do journalists continue to rely overwhelmingly on official sources, even when it's readily evident that that reliance undermines their own ability to act in a truly independent fashion? If you were aware of this, wouldn't you say to yourself, well, let's step back and review the practices and see if we should change? But there's a reason that journalists don't. Here's why journalists tend to rely on official sources. Number one, it's easy. Official sources are very good at providing easy information. If you want information about the Austin city government, go down to City Hall and there will be a public information office that will give you reams of information. You go over to the University of Texas Office of Public Information. They'll hand you everything you want to know about the University of Texas. Right? These official sources with these institutional roles, mainly in the government and the corporation, they employ people. You've been reading about this in Bennett. This isn't news to you. They employ a lot of people to provide information to journalists. In this sense, public relations and these public information offices, you can think of them as providing a subsidy to journalism. They provide readily usable information to journalists. It's like a subsidy. As a journalist, you don't have to go collect the information, you just take it. Okay? And that's easy. Now, I don't want to be glib about this because as someone who's worked in journalism, the work of journalism is hard. And if you are especially working at smaller media outlets, like daily newspapers in small cities, they're typically short-staffed. If you've ever interned or you've been around newsrooms, you know that there are very few people producing a lot of news in most American newsrooms. If you've ever worked at a small broadcast station, you know how much each of those reporters is working. And so if you're on deadline, if you've got to produce that story, and you're not given adequate time to do the research, you're going to go to wherever the information is most easily available. And that's why official sources dominate, especially at those levels. If you're at the New York Times, it's a little different. The New York Times, has a much larger staff, and those reporters are given much more time to work. But for the most part, journalists rely on official sources just because it's easy. It's the path of least resistance. It's the easiest way to fulfill the requirements of your job. If you've got a city editor breathing down your neck saying, I want that copy at 5 p.m., damn it, where's that copy? And you've got an official source who's just handed you this information, you're going to be very tempted to use it without a whole lot of further research. I know this to be true because I've done it. I can't even count the number of times I did it in my career. Everybody does it because it's the way you survive, basically. It's cheap. It's easy from the point of view of the reporter. It's cheap from the point of view of the owner of the media outlet, because if you can get by with 5 reporters who are relying on this subsidized information, why hire another 5 to do more original research? Why? You can get by with the 5 that you've got. It's cheaper to rely on these kinds of official sources from the point of view of those who own the media. You can short staff and still produce news that looks like real news. It's easy. There's also a little bit of protection from libel law in this reliance on official sources. I'm not going to go into the detail about this, but there's a doctrine in libel law that allows you to escape liability if you've relied on official sources. If you're a journalism major, eventually you'll take J360 Media Law and Ethics, and you'll hear more about that. But it is a technical reason that official sources are sometimes attractive. Finally, I put on this list class allegiances. What do I mean by that? That although the United States is not a class stratified society as we sometimes think of Europe, especially Europe historically, you know, where you had distinctive classes. You had an aristocratic class, you had a working class. The United States is not a class society in that sense. Yet we all know there is this thing called social class in the United States. And it matters. It's a big source of people's identity. Some of you may come from families, for instance, where the story is about how you rise up out of the working class and become part of the professional class. Some of you are in college because you're being encouraged to transcend the class into which you were born. Okay? This is certainly part of my story. My grandfather was a blacksmith. My father was a businessman. There was this notion that you could rise in class status through education. So some of you are probably familiar with this story. I probably would have been better off staying a blacksmith, quite frankly. At least I would have learned to do something useful, work with metal. Who knows? Anyway. All right. So there is this thing called social class. And we know that people tend to identify with, draw a sense of identity from their class. Some of our identity comes from our sense of being citizens of a nation. Some of it comes from racial or ethnic identification. Some of it comes from gender. Some of it comes from, you know, our particular intellectual or artistic interests. We have a lot of things that shape our identity and our sense of who we are. But one of the things that shapes a sense of who you are is your class status. And if you look around, people tend to socialize, identify with, and hang with people of their own class. Yes? How often do you see corporate CEOs hanging out with bricklayers? Go to the country club. How many custodians are, you know, playing an afternoon round of golf at the country club? You know what I mean? There's class. Let's acknowledge there is class. Journalists, historically, in the United States, especially in the 19th century and into the early 20th century, journalists were working class. Journalists in the 19th and early 20th century came out of the working class. They typically were not college educated. The idea that journalists should go to college is a fairly recent development, especially the last half of the 20th century. Now, if journalists are working class, their class identity, their class allegiances are going to tend to be with the working class. When journalists start to move into a more professional class, where there's an expectation of college education, an expectation of a certain professional status, journalist class allegiances shift. And they have shifted considerably in the United States. Now, journalists don't make as much money as lawyers and doctors and businessmen and women. We know that. Journalism, unless you're, you know, a network news anchor, journalism doesn't tend to compensate you financially like these other occupations do. But it does provide you a sense of a class identity. Journalists, for instance, wear suits. The men, the women dress appropriately in business attire, especially the higher you go up the ladder in journalism. You go into the New York Times office, you don't see people looking like me. They're people who look professional. Right? They go to parties where there are other professional people. They hang out with and see themselves as part of that professional class, that educated class, and I'll use the term that somewhat elite class. The higher up you go, the more you'll see this happen. So there's a question of class allegiances in why journalism plays out the way it does in these sourcing practices. So what I've suggested so far is that objectivity can mean many things in many contexts. And that objectivity in journalism will come with a certain rhetorical commitment to these ideals about, using logic and evidence, bracketing out your passions, keeping an open mind, a commitment to honesty in factual reporting. All of that is part of the rhetoric of objectivity, but that when you look at objectivity as it works out day to day in the newsroom, objectivity really means a certain kind of professional practice that's rooted in the question of who is and who isn't a reputable source. Because journalists rely on sources to construct their picture of the world. And that those sources that are deemed reputable, authoritative, credible, those sources you can use without question, tend to come from these two powerful institutions, the government and the corporate world, and that there are effects of that. Okay? Now, I was going to play you one more clip, but I don't have time, so let me finish with some of the discussion around objectivity in newsrooms. Objectivity as a term to describe the practices we're discussing started to become somewhat tainted, probably starting as much as 20 years ago. Because objectivity implies an ideal that we all know is relatively difficult to obtain. We talked about these intellectual virtues in objectivity, but we know that no one really attains them. We try to rely on reason and evidence, but we also know we are emotional and passionate beings. So there's a sense that everyone understands that no one is completely objective. Even the most rigorous scientist, right, is still a human being. And because of the kind of animals we are, objectivity at best is an ideal we might strive for in the best sense of the term. And so when it became clear that journalists were human beings and were trapped by the same realities that all human beings are, and when people would criticize journalists for not being objective, journalists started to say, okay, we're not objective. We're not these perfect, information gathering machines who can live outside of all of the complexity of being human. And you started to see journalists talking about being fair and balanced rather than being objective. So in the rhetoric of journalism, journalists stopped using the term objectivity. And they started using terms like fairness and balance. I put up on the screen a quote from a recent piece in the New York Times by Bill Keller, who's the executive editor. He is the top journalist at the New York Times. And here you see some of the rhetoric he's using. He's responding to these same critiques that the New York Times is biased and such things. And he's using the term impartial. We strive to be impartial. I don't think he uses the word objective in that whole column. And here you see his description of what it means to be impartial. The point I want to make today is that if you have a set of practices that traditionally have been called or been labeled as objective, right, and that these practices are mostly about the decision about who is and who isn't a credible source. If you have this set of practices and they've been labeled objective and people start to question the notion of objectivity, and you simply switch the label you use to describe the practices, but the practices themselves don't change, you haven't done anything important except change the label. And I'm arguing that's what journalists have done. that journalists started to be criticized for not being truly objective. Journalists acknowledged that objectivity in some pure sense is impossible, and they started coming up with other terms to describe what they do. Terms like fair and balanced, terms like impartial. The point I'm trying to make is if the underlying practices, the way the job is done, don't change, it doesn't matter what you call it. The question is not the term you use to describe these things, it's the practices themselves. Let me give you an example. We're here in a large lecture, a large lecture class, correct? It's based on a model in which one person, me, stands up and talks to a lot of you. It's a model in which there is virtually no opportunity in this setting for conversation, for engagement. You are passive recipients of what I am telling you is knowledge, correct? Let's tell the truth. You sit, you listen, you write it down, I evaluate you. Now you can say it's good or bad, there are advantages to this, there are disadvantages. We've talked about this before. But a lot of people don't like this model. A lot of people think this renders students as passive recipients instead of active participants in the creation of knowledge. And that's a valid argument. So let's say that we call this a large lecture class. And it's based on this one-to-many passive student model. And let's say there starts to be a critique of it. And I acknowledge the critique. And so I say, well, you know what? This large lecture class format is bad. So I'm going to move to an individuated, integrative, large lecture class format in which student participation is enhanced through an alternative model of varied learning objectives. What if don't bother to write that down because it's just a bunch of bullshit. Okay, in other words, if I renamed this class with a whole lot of jargon that had nice words like interactive and integrative, you know, the words that people use to try and make something sound nice. If I relabeled this class and then came in here next class period and lectured at you the way I always do, would it matter that I changed the name for how we describe the class? No, if you're on your toes, you would say, Jensen, you're still boring us to death with your damn lectures and your stupid PowerPoints. You didn't do anything. You're just changing the name because you were criticized, and so you shifted the name, not the practice. My practices would remain the same. The way I do the job would remain the same. What I'm suggesting is that journalism has gone through a lot of conversations over the last 20 years especially that have wrestled with this notion of the limits of objectivity. The term objectivity itself has been largely abandoned. The practices themselves have not changed. If anything, journalism, I would argue, is more dependent on official sources today than it was 20 years ago. Because the cutbacks in funding for journalism have left fewer reporters doing the same amount of work. And when you have fewer reporters doing the same amount of work, they're going to rely even more on these official sources. And in fact, the research suggests that journalists' reliance, especially on PR, if anything, is intensifying. And when you watch that documentary, Toxic Sludge is Good for You, you saw how that plays out. So the point of the discussion today, again, is not to suggest that journalism has no value, that journalists never do good work, that journalists never bring to bear on questions of public importance an independent, critical evaluation. They do it all the time. And I really want to emphasize this because in critiquing journalism, I don't want to suggest that journalism has no value. I say it over and over again. I am a devoted reader of newspapers. I pay money for newspapers I could read online for free. I scour the journalism available in the world. I really appreciate and enjoy journalism. The critique of journalism that we're offering in this class is not to suggest that journalism is irrelevant or that journalism is hopeless. It's to suggest that the practices of journalists should be subjected to the same scrutiny that journalists claim to apply to the rest of the world. That journalism is this institution that we should look at, evaluate, and critique just as we look at, evaluate, and critique other institutions in the government and in the economy. Right? So you could say that this is a kind of loving critique of journalism from my point of view. Right? It's not based in malice or a desire to destroy journalism. It's not meant to suggest to you that you should abandon journalism if it's a career interest. Right? There are always a few students who come up to me and say, I was going to be a journalist till I took your J310 class. That is not my, I mean, it happens. It's not my intention, though. Right? Let me state it. I used to be a journalist. In some ways, some of my writing is still very journalistic. Some of my best friends are journalists. No, really, they are. Right? This is not an attack on journalism. It's an attempt to understand where journalism falls short, precisely because journalism is so important. If journalism didn't matter, I wouldn't go to this trouble, nor would the other people who try to understand it go to this trouble. If journalism was irrelevant, I wouldn't care. But it's precisely because if democracy is going to mean something, journalism has got to be a part of that. And that's why this critique of journalism to me is so important.